Teleology.
Teleology of free sparring and ITF style Taekwondo.
Thank you. daeryeon, gyeorugi, Matseogi. These three, Korean terms all translate into English usually as sparring, but they have different nuances in Korean, and that's a little bit important because the different Taekwondo groups uses different terms, and my argument is that based on the term we can get an idea of what the telos of sparring is. Now, telos from teleology means a doctrine explaining phenomena by their end goals or purposes, and telos is just a fancy word for saying the ultimate goal of something. So, what is the telos of gyeorugi? What's the telos of Matseogi? Meaning, what is the purpose of these different types of sparring? Before I continue, I need to give some background information about Korean terminology or Taekwondo terminology and how it changed. As might be controversial but irrefutable, Taekwondo is strongly based on Japanese karate, and because of that, some karate terms was part of early Taekwondo, and it changed because the Koreans did not want to use the language of the oppressor, the language of the colonizer, so they wanted to change and get more authentically Korean terms. At first, what they did was choose Sino-Korean words. So some terms were used in Japanese are based on Chinese characters, and Korean people just translated those Chinese characters into the Korean lexis. And eventually, even that was embarrassing, and maybe part of it is this myth of creating this long lineage of Taekwondo being a very authentically Korean martial art. So they changed it to pure Korean, and I have some examples of this here. So the term kata in Japanese for forms was hyong originally, and then within the Kukki Taekwondo stream, it became pumse. Pumse is a neologism based on those Chinese characters. This word pumse doesn't exist. Those Chinese characters doesn't exist in that combination in Chinese. It's a new word that Koreans came up with. And in the ITF style of Taekwondo, til is used. Another example is knife hand being the outer edge of the hand used for blocking or striking. Japanese is shuto, and Korean sudo. Notice the similarity in pronunciation, shuto and sudo, and both are based on the same hanja. They're in red, you can see the same Chinese characters. Eventually this was changed into an authentically pure Korean term, sonkal or sonal, literally son, hand, and kal, knife, sonal. And now, with that in mind, let's look at sparring in Japanese, kumite. Early Taekwondo used the term daeryeon. Daeryeon sparring is a good translation. More sparring exercises, probably sparring drills, is probably a better translation. And this is what was used in like the 1940s, 1950s, even 1960s. In 1970, around 1972, if my research is correct, the term was changed within the WTF or Kukki stream to gyeorugi. And in ITF in 1975, Matseogi. So let's first look at gyeorugi. What does this mean? Gyeorugi is based on the verb gyeoruda, that means to compete, vie for, or contend with, and the inflection is gyeorugi, meaning to dual competition, competition sparring. So dual competition sparring. So this term gyeorugi is clearly a sport term. It's not just any type of fighting. It's fighting for the means of competition. So what is the telos implied by the term gyeorugi? Well, in 1973, the first World Championships was held. Directly after the World Championships, the World Taekwondo Federation was founded, and the term gyeorugi was used in 1972. So it was all clearly focusing on sport. The WTF at that time was to regulate sport sparring. And so the term gyeorugi is a very good choice for that type of activity that happens within the WTF style of Taekwondo. So they changed daeryeon being a Chinese-based, Hanja-based term, to this Korean, pure Korean word, gyeorugi, referring to competition sparring. In ITF Taekwondo, another term was used, the term Matseogi. And Matseogi is based on the verb matsoda, which means to oppose, to confront, to stand up to stand against, to face an enemy, to resist a force. And you all know that famous photo. The person in that photo is doing matsoda. He is standing against an approaching threat. That's matsoda. The term matseogi then is meaning to guard, to confront, to resist, to defend, to to face an opposition, to fight. So it's a very different type of sparring, if we want to use the English term sparring, than gyeorugi. The underlying implication is quite different. So what's the telos of Matseogi? Well, the telos of Matseogi is not sport, it's not competition, it's something like confrontation, conflict readiness, to be prepared to fight, or self-defense would be a good explanation for what the telos of Matseogi might be. So, with this in mind, let's look at ITF Taekwondo and how Matseogi fits within their pedagogy, or at least supposedly fits within their pedagogy. So, if Matseogi is about being prepared for self-defense, getting fight ready for actual violent conflict, it means you should be able to keep standing in the face of actual violence, in the chaos of real violence. This is really difficult because your brain has to compute a lot of variables, and I'm going to use that term variables often. So your brain has to assess whether they are threats, what are their intent, how many of these threats are there, what type of attacks are they attacking you with. Is it like a haymaker punch, a hooking punch, is it straight punch? How many of these attacks are there? Are there kicks involved? Maybe weapons. And then what's the speed that this comes at you, and which distance is it from you, and what's the angle, and what's your footing like? Is the floor slippery? Are there obstacles? Maybe there's broken glass. Can you block any of these? Can you dodge? And these are just a few of hundreds more calculations, variables that your brain has to calculate and instinctively come up with a solution. It's almost impossible. So how do you prepare for this? So there's one way you can prepare, and this is getting good at fighting method 1. Basically, you go to a bar where there's lots of drunk people, and you just wait for the fight to happen, or maybe you initiate the fight, and you do this regularly every weekend, maybe every Wednesday and Saturday night, and over time your brain will start to see some patterns in this thing, and your brain will start to figure out what are typical threats and so on. And that's a way of getting good at fighting, and some people actually get good at fighting this way. Hopefully they don't go to jail or get serious concussions, broken, maybe die. So it's not the ideal way, it's definitely not for everyone. There's another method which we can do, and this is what I call getting good at fighting method 2. And this is a method that some martial arts, traditional martial arts, have tried. And I'm not saying this method is the correct one, there's maybe other ones, but this is the one that's used by ITF Taekwondo as well. So in this picture you see a face on the far, is that your, what's that, your right? On the far right. And the face is very clear, very detailed. We can say there are lots of pixels in there. So it is high resolution. On the opposite end, there's also a face, but it's very abstract. So we say it's high in abstraction. This means this one has very few variables, whereas the one on the other side has lots of variables. If you go in closer, you'll see lots of pixels of color and so on, where this one has just some patches of color. And this is what the traditional martial arts try to do, or at least ITF Taekwondo's Matseogi pedagogy functions on this way. So on our next slide, you start on this end, beginner level, very abstract. We call this pre-arranged sparring, or yaksok Matseogi. Yaksok literally means promise. So you and your partner have made a promise of what type of attacks you might expect, and then you can defend and counter-attack, something like that. So this is very elementary. We've taken away almost all the variables that there would be in an actual fight. It's not realistic, and it's not realistic on purpose. Why? Because we want to train some specific skills, which is really difficult to train when it's just chaotic. So when the beginner has learned some specific skills, we introduce another variable. And we do so continuously, and slowly the type of the conflict is increased, the variables are increased, so that the abstraction is reduced and it becomes more realistic towards the end. So pre-sparring, pre-arranged sparring, to semi-free sparring, to free sparring, and actual self-defense training on the end. If this is true, then we can say ITF Taekwondo is teleologically successful. What I mean by this is that Matseogi, the term Matseogi, matches the goal of self-defense preparation, but it's not true. It doesn't work like that, and I'll explain why now. In 1974, the ITF had their first World Championships, and the sparring was called jayu Matseogi. Competition sparring was called jayu Matseogi. So jayu Matseogi is one of those steps, and it's one where free sparring, there's not many restrictions, but competition sparring is not free sparring because of rules. The competition rules apply too many variables, too many restrictions, so it's not actually free or unrestricted. And the ITF Encyclopedia actually admits this in some ways, saying that there are all these limitations, and these limitations tell us that it's not really free. It doesn't come close to real combat, real self-defense. So there's the problem. The actual telos is not achieved, and the reason is because competition sparring now has the name jayu Matseogi, and that's the problem. How can we fix it? So my proposed solution is that the term jayu Matseogi, which means free or unrestricted sparring, should not be used for competition sparring in ITF Taekwondo. Gyeorugi, used by WT Taekwondo, is a very appropriate term for competition sparring, and that's what should be used instead. And then actual jayu Matseogi, as a reality-based exercise, should be reintroduced, because that is what it's supposed to be. I forgot, it was Dr. Karpner that spoke about the MMA. So free sparring within the ITF pedagogy is supposed to resemble MMA a little bit better. Well, should be similar to MMA in the sense that you can use all the tools available to you including going to the ground. And these are things that are in the ITF encyclopedia, ground fighting, throwing techniques, and all of that. And definition for free sparring is sparring without restriction. So this is how it should look, starting with high abstraction on this end, going through different types of sparring, including competition sparring, then free sparring being after competition sparring, because competition sparring still has too many restrictions to resemble self-defense or real fighting, then free sparring on the other end, close to actual self-defense. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanko Lewis. Now we are going to have our panel discussion. So I'd like to have all of the presenters come up here and sit down, and then we will have a little over 20 minutes to be having the panel discussion. We're going to take this to 16:15. So right now it's 15.